Hello friends, my name is JJ, and if you are new to this channel, I'm a guy who talks about countries, culture, and Canada. Canada being the country where I live. And you know who else likes talking about Canada? Simon Whistler. For those who don't know, Simon Whistler is a British YouTuber who runs something like 10,000 different educational channels and clearly aspires to become the explainer king of YouTube. As a result, he has made hundreds and hundreds of videos on basically every topic under the sun, including at least 5 about Canada. And while I certainly respect Simon's hustle, I think he is also a bit of a case study in what happens when you value quantity over quality, because, spoiler alert, none of his Canada videos are very good. In fact, I think a lot of them will actually leave you more ignorant of Canada for having watched them. So here is Simon's first Canada-themed video from 2017. It is entitled, "Things About Canada the Rest of the World Finds Weird." It is basically just a very cliched survey of various tired Canadian stereotypes that is probably not worth spending too much time on. He talks about poutine and ketchup-flavored potato chips and saying "A" and all of this other very predictable stuff. And as usual, the popularity of various quirky things is grossly overstated, like when he says that Canada worships the band, the Tragically Hip.
In Canada though, the band, well, it was worshipped.
When I think at best you could say that they were sort of a second-tier alternative band. And of course he claims that curling is some sort of really big deal.
And in case you're wondering, yes, in Canada, some curlers are celebrities.
When it's actually a pretty fringe sport that most Canadians know nothing about. And he has some really overwritten babble about why Canadians are supposedly so polite.
Our guess is something called the fragment theory, which is when a colonial country keeps some old world sensibilities. This makes Canadians conservative and deferential, which could be construed as polite. A second theory is that the foundation of Canada was English, French, and the Aboriginal people who coexisted with each other using tolerance and politeness, and those traditions have carried on into modern Canadian society.
And he subjects us to this despite conceding earlier in the video that it is basically impossible to empirically prove that one country is nicer than another.
Measuring niceness across a country is really hard to do.
But it is Simon's 4 videos on Canadian politics that I find far more irritating in their flamboyant ignorance. In all of these videos, Simon adopts a position as like Canada's biggest cheerleader. The unifying thesis, even in the video that claims to show Canada's dark side, is that Canada is this super together country that lacks any real problems and has basically figured out the right answer to every major public policy question. I honestly find this Canadian stereotype far more obnoxious than anything about like poutine or whatever, just because it seems to involve a far more aggressive effort to not appreciate Canada as a real or complex place. Simon is a political progressive who clearly decided a long time ago that Canada is simply going to be his good example country, and as a result, everything he reports about Canada is shoehorned into that predetermined conclusion. His first video about Canadian politics was also made in 2017, and it is called "Why Does Canada Want More Immigrants?" The thesis of this video is that Canada has a very high rate of immigration, and this has been an unqualified, unambiguous national triumph. Indeed, he presents immigration as basically the sole reason why Canada has a strong economy and why the country, in his words, has been so successful.
And this is precisely why Canada is so successful. They are a country that takes pride in looking for additional citizens, and the results support these policies indeed.
And this success is apparently so self-evident that he implies Canada doesn't really have any political dissent at all on the issue of immigration, unlike various nasty other countries.
The fact of the matter is that this hasn't led to any sort of national tragedy. In fact, quite the opposite, and Canadians well know this. Compared to the new nationalist and populist tendencies of other countries, Canada has shown what a desirable alternative openness can really be.
But of course, immigration is controversial in Canada as it is controversial everywhere else. At the time Simon made this video, for instance, the province of Quebec, Canada's second biggest province, had been engaged for several years in a bipartisan discussion over just how strict a ban prohibiting Muslim women from wearing a headscarf while interacting with the state should be. This would eventually culminate with Quebec voters electing a hardline anti-immigration government in 2018 that would proceed to cut legal immigration to the province by 20%. Indeed, polls tend to suggest that Canada's high rates of immigration exist in spite of, not because of, public support. For several decades now, the majority of Canadians have been telling pollsters they want to see the country's immigration rate either capped or lowered, and there have been just as many polls suggesting Canadians have rather harsh opinions when it comes to stuff like immigrants not doing enough to fit in or taking Canadian jobs. But in any case, Simon seems most interested in cheering on what he imagines to be the simple genius of Canada's immigration policy.
If you really think about it, it does make sense. Employment is the country's most productive asset, so why would they want to prevent it from growing? In the context of a dynamic economy, what's the harm of immigrants who are willing to work, who are willing to set up companies, and want to get an education? It is something that we at Visual Politic think is actually pretty good.
And that's fine to believe as an abstract principle, but in practice, that's not really what the Canadian immigration system is. Immigration is a very complicated government program that inevitably results in a lot of trade-offs between the economic side and the human side. So here is an example. In his videos, Simon often cites the work of the Fraser Institute, which is a pro-market Canadian think tank. So he may be interested to know that in 2014, the Institute released a paper that argued immigrants to Canada are actually a net burden on the Canadian economy, costing the government as much as $35 billion annually. This is because present Canadian immigration policy recognizes that it would be, on some level, fundamentally inhumane to only let in immigrants who
are willing to work, who are willing to set up companies, and want to get an education.
According to the most recent annual numbers we have, the majority of immigrants that Canada accepted as permanent residents were simply relatives of other immigrants. Here is another example. This was a striking chart published in Maclean's magazine in 2016. This gray gap is basically the hole of young workers Canada needs to fill in order to make up for our growing number of retirees. And here's how the chart looks after we add all of the immigrants welcomed by Prime Minister Trudeau's record high intake that Simon praises. I'm not trying to be pro or anti-immigrant here. I'm just saying that when you look at the data, the system in Canada seems to be relatively neutral in effect. And this is without even getting into stuff like the persistent wage and employment gap between Canadian immigrants and the native-born, or stuff relating to racism and discrimination like we alluded to earlier. In short, anyone who tells you that Canada's immigration system has been an unmitigated success story, as Simon does not know what he is talking about. Simon's follow-up video, Why is Canada the most admired country on Earth?, which has close to 1 million views, is really more of the same. This is a video that seeks to explain the success of Canada, but seems to have been mostly researched with press releases. The thesis is basically that Canada under Prime Minister Trudeau represents an inspiring model of openness, and this is why everyone in the world apparently looks up to Canada so much. At one point, he sums it up like this.
And especially and above all, Canadians have really understood the importance and meaning of these two words: competitiveness and integration.
So we already talked a little bit about the integration side of things, but what about competitiveness? Well, I'm sad to say that Canada is actually regarded as being on the low end of the competitiveness spectrum among the major industrialized economies. Among economists, competitiveness is widely seen as one of Canada's key national deficits, not strengths. The World Economic Forum currently ranks Canada as only the 14th most competitive national economy, behind places like America, Britain, Germany, Japan, and South Korea. We have been languishing here in the low teens for about a decade now, and there is no sign that we are going to be getting out anytime soon. Canada's competitiveness gap is often blamed on the fact that Canadian governments have imposed a lot of explicitly anti-competition subsidies and regulations. These are generally designed to prop up entrenched Canadian business interests who fear the sort of open market foreign competition that Simon claims we Canadians so happily embrace. In fact, even within Canada, special interests have fought very hard to maintain barriers preventing the free flow of goods and labor among the provinces, which is a very unusual thing to see in a modern advanced economy. It's probably why the World Economic Forum ranks us in 54th place in terms of internal labor mobility, and 53rd place in terms of prevalence of non-tariff trade barriers. Simon seems vaguely aware of some of this in his video, but the way he engages with it is almost completely incoherent. Like, I challenge you to follow along with this argument, which is supposed to be him explaining why Canada has one of the freest economies on Earth.
Maybe the reason for this is the strong decentralization that the country has. Canada, it's divided into 10 provinces and 3 territories that have so many unique regulations that in 2017 they actually had to sign a free trade agreement among them.
I will just note here that this agreement he's speaking of was a completely symbolic thing that accomplished nothing, but let's continue.
The decentralization is absolutely enormous, and it has traditionally resulted in higher costs for those companies that don't operate in a single region but in several different regions, with each region having different regulations.
In Ontario, petrol must be at least 5% ethanol. Manitoba insists on an 8.5% blend.
The positive side of this is that this has worked as a counterweight to the federal government, and it's encouraged them to make pro-citizen policies, and that's something that has driven good public policies. Anyway, this new agreement has been created in order to beat all these surprising obstacles. Further, as we talked about in a previous video, there's also the Canadian bet on multiculturalism.
So basically he's saying that the regulations are sort of bad, but sort of good, and also they signed a thing. And now let's talk about multiculturalism. An almost equally striking bit comes near the end, when he praises all of the good things that Prime Minister Trudeau has done.
Doors open to technology, integration, civil rights, security, all these things don't sound bad at all, right? Especially if you consider that this government understands that before starting to discuss spending, you have to talk about wealth creation.
So this is an almost breathtakingly ignorant statement. One of the most politically noteworthy things about Prime Minister Trudeau's election in 2015 was that he was elected on an explicit platform of deficit spending. Trudeau very explicitly promised, in defiance of a lot of the conventional wisdom of the time, that his agenda of increased government spending was not, in fact, going to be correlated to economic growth, but was rather going to happen regardless.
We're the only party has said, yes, we will run 3 modest deficits because it's time to invest in Canada once again and give people the support they need. I'm being honest with Canadians. We're going to run 3 deficits and we're going to invest in the future Canadians need right now.
And as a result, Trudeau's entire prime ministership has been defined by deep deficit spending. So yeah, a lot of praise for things that are just objectively not happening. All right, and then we have Simon's 2 videos that are theoretically critical of Canada. The more recent of the 2, How Did Canada Avoid Bankruptcy, basically represents an effort to provide an origin story explaining how Canada became the wonderful economic powerhouse it is today.
However, things in Canada weren't always this happy. There was a time in the 1960s, and especially in the 1970s, where everything was about to collapse.
And I will give Simon credit here, because the story he tells does indeed resemble a sort of conventional tale you often hear told about this country. Namely, that the Liberal government that ran Canada during the 1990s deserves credit for course-correcting what had previously looked to be an unsustainable course of out-of-control debt and deficit spending.
Well, the fact is that for the first few years, the leftist government launched a sharp public spending cut, eliminated many unnecessary programs, and adjusted spending. In just 2 years, in real terms, spending dropped by 15%. Under the principle, which states that the state shouldn't do things that companies can do better, the government decided to continue with the privatization plan. The fact is that in just 4 years, the situation was under control. The government had gone from having a huge deficit to having a surplus.
Simon does, however, portray the old man Trudeau, who he blames as being the root cause of all of this, in a rather cartoonish way, as if he primarily researched him by reading right-wing blogs.
Trudeau Sr. wanted to implement a new political model in Canada, which was a bit different from Washington's capitalism and somewhat closer to Soviet Moscow's collectivism. If that wasn't enough, he also made the central bank print banknotes to spare to expand credit and finance the government. And, well, maybe this recipe is starting to sound a bit familiar to you.
Well, Venezuela's adding more zeros to its currency, releasing bills with larger denominations.
The new government wanted to completely change the country's model once and for all, and no, they no longer wanted anything to do with Moscow or the Soviet model.
But whatever, the bigger flaw is, I think, just this weird conclusion.
Canada went from being considered an honorary member of the Third World by the Wall Street Journal due to its public debt problems to becoming the most fashionable country in the world. The Liberal Party hadn't only solved the country's problems, they had changed its model. In the following years, up until today, all political options opt for the Canadian model.
The most fashionable country in the world? All political options opt for the Canadian model? What does this even mean? It's also kind of weird that he implies early on that Justin Trudeau has nothing politically in common with his father.
Of course, father and son's politics are by no means the same. It looks like Justin Trudeau certainly did his homework.
When actually, I would say that a pretty common criticism of Justin Trudeau is that he has too much in common with his father and not enough in common with the Liberal leaders of the 1990s, just given his unapologetic return to deficit spending that I mentioned earlier. In fact, one of the reasons we even tell this story of the 1990s in modern-day Canada is as a cautionary tale to avoid drifting back into old bad habits. But to Simon, the story is merely one more opportunity to engage in some simplistic Canadian cheerleading. Okay, and then lastly we have this video. Why is Canada not as perfect as it looks? You gotta love the framing here. Not as perfect as it looks. Or as Simon puts it,
not everything can be sunshine, lollipops, and rainbows.
Because that is how most of us think about Canada. Anyway, much of this video is devoted in a sort of airy, passive way to the plight of the Canadian Indian, the history of oppression, and the modern-day social ills. This is indeed a serious problem, and someday when I have the courage, I would like to make a video of my own on it. But what I find to be quite obnoxious is the way that the suffering of the Indigenous peoples of Canada is sort of becoming sentimentalized into like the one official Canadian problem, particularly since their plight is often only ever brought up in the context of giving Trudeau praise for finally addressing the issue in some way.
In fact, the government of Justin Trudeau has made it a priority. Consider what the Prime Minister had to say on the 21st of June of this year.
No relationship is more important to Canada than the relationship with the Indigenous peoples.
The same is true for all of the other very mild first world problems that Simon identifies as being the dark side of Canada, like the high cost of housing, wait times in the public healthcare system, or the difficulty of dealing with Donald Trump. In all of these cases, we are assured that Trudeau is on it, so none of the stakes feel particularly high.
Even today, Canada is still looking for the best way to move forward from this dark period of its history. Doing something about this has become another priority of the Canadian government. You know what? We think that the overall result of the Canadian cocktail, well, we think it looks pretty good.
And there is certainly no talk of any Canadian problems that are a lot less politically sexy, like drug addiction, homelessness, the democratic deficit in the Canadian political system, Quebec chauvinism, Western alienation, and ongoing talent brain drain to America, or indeed any of the economic problems relating to the competitiveness gap or the deficit that Simon has previously assured us do not exist. Now, by his own admission, Simon does not research or write a lot of his own scripts. Based on some of the behind-the-scenes stuff of his that I've seen, he has a pretty sophisticated assembly line production system involving a whole team of researchers and writers and editors. This is what allows him to generate such enormous amounts of content and release multiple videos a week across his multi-channel empire. And on the surface, all of these videos seem very slick and well produced. They have nice, clean visuals and are competently edited. But when you pay close attention, you find something far less impressive. You'll find videos that are not only quite superficial and weakly researched, but also tend to feature long, rambling lead-ins, half-formed arguments that don't really go anywhere, and plenty of musical stock footage montages that I assume only exist to pad the video's length for algorithm purposes. There was a line in a recent NPR review of Mark Levin's latest book that I quite liked. According to the FDA, for something to be marketed as cheese, most of its makeup has to be cheese, not filler. Otherwise, it is generally called cheese product. If there were similar rules for books, Unfreedom of the Press would have to be sold as book product. There are many, many good people on YouTube who make educational videos that are well-researched, insightful, and informative. Simon's videos are closer to the cheese whiz end of the spectrum.